Hello, my name is Tom Connors, the great-grandson of Thomas and Maria Moore, who are the main subjects of this presentation. I'm speaking to you today, October 6th, 2021, from Curtis, Ontario, in Canada. This is a story of a young couple, Thomas and Maria Moore, who emigrated from Ireland to Canada in search of a new life. What were their experiences, and how did their children fare? Over the next 20 minutes or so, we will look at the facts available to us through historical records to try to learn how it all turned out for them. Along with the historical records are a few family stories that have been handed down, and the inclusion of those will perhaps keep them from getting lost through the passage of time. These stories, as few as they are, might give us a better insight into people's personalities than even the historical facts do. The information contained here is factual as much as possible, backed up by historical records, or in some cases, stories relayed by other family members. Of course, there is the opportunity to do a little speculating based on the facts, and that has been done as well. Something else worth mentioning here is the fact that some of the handed-down family stories may have taken on a life of their own, as they have strayed a little from reality. In locating the true facts through historical records, there has been a realignment of some of these stories. Complete details, including links to official records, are located at ancestry.ca under the name Connors Family Tree, NOV for November, _2007. Access to the complete file will require a free trial sign-up or a full membership fee to be paid to Ancestry. As one delves into historical archives to learn more about parts of a family tree, it is easy to get wrapped up in the details of dates and historical records. However, when taken in their entirety, these records and facts can start to tell the most amazing stories about the lives of these people. This has been the fascinating part for me in my search to gather information for our family tree. In the end, each of us has to be so much more than a name, date of birth, and date of death on a tombstone, and in the absence of the impossible opportunity to learn from those who have already gone before us, it's only these records and handed down stories that are left for us to interpret. I decided to put this video together for other interested family members who may not know much of those who went before us. They are, even in a small way, a part of whom each of us is today. Of course, this is true more so for those who are somewhat closer to the top of the descendancy line, coming from our subjects, Thomas and Maria. This is a story mostly about Thomas Henry Moore and his wife, Maria Jane Browne, two ordinary young people from County Cavan in Ireland, both children of farmers who decided to start a new life by emigrating to Canada. I will also include facts about each of their children and the lives they led. If the retelling of their life story was turned into a full-length movie, undoubtedly the first scenes would include views of a young couple nervously but excitedly anticipating what lies ahead for them, and wild scenes of stormy seas with the crashing of thunderous waves and howling winds as they crossed the expansive and dangerous Atlantic Ocean in a not overly large sailboat. Thomas and Maria probably left Ireland for Canada in 1875. No official record can be found to verify the dates of departure and arrival, the ports of departure and arrival, or the ship that they came on. Given the time period, we might imagine that the tumultuous opening scenes of the Hollywood movie could have portrayed what Thomas and Maria experienced. The fact is that by the 1870s, most immigrants, more than 90% in fact, arrived by steamships which were large, sturdy, and fast, and meant that most crossings were not such a huge ordeal. But things were not totally stress-free for Thomas and Maria. At the time of their journey, they were imminently expecting their first child, and it must have been somewhat stressful to think that baby could come along during the sea crossing or soon afterwards as they proceeded inland towards their destination in Ontario. Before we get into all of that, let's look back on what little we know of the early life of Thomas and Maria. Thomas was born in June 1850 on his father's farm at Agaway, Diocese of Kilmore, Parish of Lara, County of Cavan. According to the Griffiths valuation of 1847 to 1864, Thomas's father, James Moore, had a farm of 40 arable acres and some additional 14 acres on which stood a house and offices. By comparison to his neighbors, James' property was bigger than most, but not the biggest. Thomas had at least one other sibling, a younger brother also named James after his father. It's not clear why Thomas, as the eldest son, did not take over the farm as I think would have been expected in those days. Records show that his younger brother did. What we do know is that as a young man, Thomas went afield for work. He was hired as a farm laborer, horse groomer in fact, by Maria's father, whose farm was less than 2 kilometers away from his own father's farm. As is usually the case, family stories often change a little with each retelling. Before finding out differently through record searching, the family story regarding Thomas was that he was just a drifter working for Maria's father. Thomas and Maria fell in love, and because it was not with the approval of her father, as the story goes, Maria and Thomas had to run away to get married. But that's the old story. Although he might have been perceived as a drifter by some, the marriage record for Thomas and Maria shows that Thomas came from a decent background and that they were married in the town of Browne, not so far from the Browne and Moore farms, so it hardly seems likely that they ran away to be married, or at least if they did, they didn't run far. One of the witnesses to the marriage was Maria's brother Archibald, or Archie as he was known. It may be that their father didn't approve of the marriage, but it certainly was an event that was known and supported by others of Maria's family. Thomas and Maria were married in December 1873, just over a year or two before they traveled to Canada. There is one other factor that could have been why Thomas and Maria chose the paths they did, and that is religion. Thomas was born to a Catholic family, and Maria's was Protestant. Perhaps the fathers of both families objected strongly to the union. Also, could this be the reason Thomas didn't take over his father's farm? It's possible that the prospects of a new start in Canada seemed like the best option for the young couple. At the time of Maria's marriage to Thomas, again in December of 1873, she was 24 and he was 23. Maria was born in 1849 on her father's farm on lands at Drumharriff South, Barony of Tullygarvie, County of Cavan. Maria's father, John Browne, had an exact total of 75 acres, 2 roods, and 26 perches, according to the document entitled Local Registration of Title Ireland Act, 1891. He was one of the largest landowners in his region and was a farmer with a certain amount of prestige amongst his peers. Incidentally, the name Browne sometimes appears as Browne with an E at the end and sometimes without in official records. Roods and perches? There are 4 roods to an acre and 40 perches to a rood. A single rood is about the size of 2 tennis courts. So I've worked it out for you. The Browne farm is the size of 604 3/4 tennis courts. While working on the family tree over the years, I often wondered about the history of the Browne family and how they were able to acquire such a substantial farm. The family is Presbyterian, and that indicates with some certainty that they were immigrants from Scotland. There is a lot of historical information on how and when 2 things I would like to talk about happened. First, the Scottish immigration to Ireland, and second, the eventual transfer of land ownership from the nobles to the common man and farmer. But let's keep it short and to the point. Much of the Scottish migration to plantations in Ireland occurred between 1610 to about 1630, and these immigrants were known as Ulster Scots. The migration happened as the result of a promise of land that had been seized by the British from Irish earls who fled Ireland for their own protection. Some 10,000 Scotsmen were brought to Ireland to take part in the land scheme. They had to be of the Protestant faith, promise to build a house and barn on their land, and also become a part of the militia in times of trouble. It's expected that the early Browns were a part of this group. However, these newly arrived farmers were tenants of the land and not owners. The owners were people of British peerage who were granted large tracts of land by the English Parliament. Rent was paid by the tenants generation after generation to the owners for a period of almost 300 years. A process of transferring freehold farmland to tenant-farmer ownership was started in 1885 as a result of farmer rebellions from a few years before. A commission was set up and given authority to determine land sizes, prices to be paid, and who should be given the rights to purchase the land. This process took years to complete. The Brownes registered their desire to purchase the farm they lived on and worked once it became possible. It is not known how long the family had occupied Drumharrif before this point. Archibald Browne, Maria's brother, was the first Browne in the process and is seen in the historical document in this regard. The document outlines the purchase price and the terms of repayment of the loan granted by the Irish government. The date was May 1, 1901. This document records the transfer of ownership since that time from father to son over 3 generations of Brownes until the land was finally paid for as of June 28, 1965. What a great day that must have been, and one that included remembrances of the generations of Brownes who came before and dedicated their lives to the farm and to the day of full ownership that had finally arrived. In about 1875, Thomas and Maria crossed the Atlantic Ocean to begin their new life together in Canada. Since there are no records available showing the ports of departure or arrival, it's not known if they first came through Halifax or through another of the major immigrant receiving ports along the eastern seaboard. Halifax is the most likely, however. It is assumed that the couple did not travel all the way to Canada without a destination in mind. We know that they went to live and work on a farm north of Whitby, Ontario, Canada, which incidentally was more than 1,700 kilometers away from Halifax, and that they were there for about 20 years. It's probable that the arrangement for this was made before they left Ireland. So in continuation of the story about Maria being imminently expecting when they arrived on the shores of North America, we know that they didn't get to complete their journey to Ontario without interruption. Along the way, their first child, daughter Annie, was born in about 1875 in Kentville, Nova Scotia, Canada, and this fact gives us reason to believe that their port of arrival was most likely Halifax. Therefore, somewhat delayed and after increasing their number by 1, they again continued their travels towards their Ontario destination. Thomas and Maria did not own the 50-acre farm they worked. Thomas was listed as a farmer laborer in the Canadian censuses done in 1881 and 1891. He and Maria lived there until the time of his death in 1896, just over 20 years. In that time, and after daughter Annie was born, they had 4 other children, 2 more daughters and 2 sons, though one son, Charles, died soon after his birth. Thomas and Maria had been brought up in religious households, at least that was certainly the case for Maria. In the 1881 Canadian census, Maria lists her faith as Presbyterian, and Thomas lists his as Church of England. In the 1891 Canadian census, they both list their religion as Methodist. There was a Methodist church built in Myrtle Station, which is only 3 kilometers away from the farm, but it wasn't built before 1908, which was a few years after Thomas had died and the surviving family moved out of the area. Until the construction of this church, and in the early days, Ontario Methodism started with circuit riders who rode around the countryside on horseback, preaching the gospel to early residents. Meetings were held in private homes before churches were built. It's likely that the Moore family attended meetings like this and possibly even hosted some. Other locations the family would have traveled to from time to time were Manchester, which was 8 kilometers away, Port Perry, 15 kilometers, and Whitby, 20 kilometers away. The crop for most southern Ontario farms in this time was wheat, which was not only for livestock feed, but also sold for export and for use by settlers who wanted to make European foods. Dairy farming and crops of corn and barley were becoming popular, and it's possible that these were additions to the wheat farming the Moore family did. As the development of mechanized farm implements had already started, the family may have had the use of a tractor. It seems more likely, though, that the heavy work on Thomas' farm was done using horses or mules. It is noted that a conveniently located active railway line passed right across the road from the farm. The railway was used for transporting goods and people, and a station and a grain elevator were located on this rail line a short distance north of them. The track no longer exists, but at the time it ran between Whitby, north through Port Perry, and in time on to Lindsay. There is another family story that tells us of Maria's mother sending her money every year, sufficient for the family to buy passage for return to Ireland. Thomas and Maria never went back. Sadly, life on the farm came to an abrupt end with the death of Thomas in 1896. The death records lists the cause as organic heart disease, which had been diagnosed 6 months earlier. He was 46 years old. I've had no luck finding where Thomas was laid to rest. Without knowing for sure, it's likely that Maria and her children had to move off of the farm at this point. The photo of Maria and her children was taken by a photographer in Port Perry, Ontario, so it appears as though they stayed in the area at least until about 1902. There is conflicting information on just where she might have lived at this time. As young adults, at least 2 of her daughters lived in Toronto, and it's conceivable Maria and Harry did as well for a period of time. A portrait of Harry taken in about 1912 was done at a Toronto photographer's studio, though whether he was living or visiting Toronto is not known. The next official record naming Maria is for a crossing of the U.S. border into Canada in 1915 to visit her daughter Bella in Toronto. She was traveling with her son, Harry, and the 2 of them lived in a home Harry rented in Detroit. No official record of Maria's death can be found either in Canada or the U.S. Another member of Ancestry has listed Maria's death date as being August 18, 1923, when she was 74 years old. There is no indication in the other members' account why this date is known to them. In any case, it seems there is a period of about 20 years between Thomas's death and her own, and apart from that one border crossing record, there is little else to indicate where she was or what she did. This studio picture of Maria and her children is certainly a family treasure. There is so much you can imagine and wonder about as you look into the eyes of each one in the picture. There is one thing that seems evident by the way they were dressed, and that is that the family was not poor, perhaps in part the result of the money Maria received each year from her mother in the hopes that she and the family would return to Ireland to live. It could also indicate a level of success the family had as early-day farmers in Ontario. In this next part, I will give a brief outline regarding the adult lives of each of Thomas and Maria's children. Annie Moore was born in Kentville, Nova Scotia in about 1875. She was 21 or so when her father died. After growing up on the farm, indications are that Annie moved away, and it may have been for love. On September 3, 1902, Annie married Daniel Henry Dacey in Boston, Massachusetts. A terrible tragedy occurred soon after their wedding. On September 11, 1902, Daniel was killed on the job. He was listed as a linesman working that day in Queens, New York. Between 2 separate records, it's not clear if Daniel was on a telephone pole which fell with him on it, or if a pole fell and hit him while on the ground. In any case, he died, and it was just 8 days after he married Annie. I'd heard a family story that indicated Annie was a bit off in her adult years, as in mentally. The way the story went, it's as though she had been jilted in her relationship with a man who went on to marry someone else, which Annie never recovered from. After discovering this terrible truth of Daniel's tragic death, it's easy to understand how profound the effect must have been on poor Annie, and it probably continued through her life. Each time I look at her in this picture, I feel a great sadness. It was taken probably soon after she lost her husband, and here she sits, mourning her loss, with her bright new wedding band shining so prominently on her finger. All her hopes and dreams for the future had been ripped away from her. From this point, Annie falls completely off the radar as far as official records go. Her places of residence and date of death are not known. Bella was born on June 10, 1876, and grew up on the farm. She was 20 when her father died. In 1911, she married Benjamin Frank Burland in Toronto, and they had a son, Robert Miles Burland. It appears as though she lived in Toronto for all of her adult life until she died in September 1936 at the age of 60. Florence Edith Moore was my grandmother. She was born on July 19, 1888, and grew up on the farm, or at least until her father's death. That happened when she was just 8 years old. She experienced one other family tragedy prior to this, and that was with the sudden death of her infant brother, Charles, when she was 3. Florence married Hugh Francis Connors, known as Hugh, in Toronto in 1910. They had 7 children. The children, Rita Mabel Connors, known as Rita, in 1910, Rhoda Mary Grace Connors in 1912, though she died as an infant, Marion Clarice Connors in 1913, Gladys Cavell Connors, known as Gladys, in 1916, Doris Frances Connors, known as Dory, in 1918, Thomas Henry Connors, my father, known as Harry, in 1921, and Roy Hugh Connors, known as Roy, in 1924. After she was married, she and Hugh lived in Toronto, Port Colborne, Oshawa, and Bowmanville. The greatest tragedy she suffered was the sudden death of her husband as the result of a traffic accident. This happened in 1926 when Florence was 37 years old. At the time, they lived in a large house on Scugog Street in Bowmanville, and Florence was left with 6 kids to raise on her own, ranging from 2 to 15 years in age. After Hugh's death, she moved to Church Street in Bowmanville and took in boarders to support herself and her family. Florence died in Bowmanville in 1951 at the age of 62. I asked Cousin Jack Humphreys if he could tell us a story of our grandmother that could give us an idea of who she was and what she was like. Jack is the last remaining cousin who was old enough at the time to remember her. Florence helped raise Jack as well as his brother and sister, Gary and Madge. Their mother, Rita, was a single mother who had a demanding job as a nurse in a Toronto hospital and therefore understandably found it difficult balancing her time between kids and work. Florence took the 3 kids into her home in Bowmanville for a number of years while they were young, and the 3 often talked of the love they had for their kind-hearted grandmother. This is Jack's story, which would have happened sometime after her sons, Harry and Roy, returned home from overseas at the end of World War II. These are Jack's words. I was too young to know much about her except as an eternal presence who ruled the house on Church Street. I do remember well the arrival of our dog, Spot. Uncle Roy had been out all night drinking, in brackets Graham was a Presbyterian teetotaler, and came home with a pup about a foot long, which he said he had won in a poker game. I'll see that and raise you the pup. Graham gave him hell and told him that there was no way she was going to let him keep it because she would have to care for it, and chased Roy out of the house. In the meantime, the pup sat in a basket behind the stove, and by the time Roy got back to tell Graham that he had someone to take the pup, we 3 kids had totally fallen in love with the poor little critter. Graham rounded on Roy and informed him that there was no way she would let one of his friends have it because they would only neglect it. And that's how soft-hearted Graham let us keep the dog. It was officially Roy's, but everybody knew it belonged to us kids. Harry was born in about 1892, and of course, as with his siblings, lived on the farm until the death of his father. He was 4 at the time. Apparently he had lived in Detroit as early as 1900 along with his mother, as this is a date he reported during his crossing at the U.S.-Canada border in 1915, when he and his mother were traveling to Toronto to visit his sister, Bella. It has been found that in 1917 Harry lived in Evanston, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. When Harry was 28 in 1920, he married Margaret Mary Egan. They had no children. In 1922, records show him listed as a laundry owner in Chicago. Sadly, he died quite young at the age of 40 on December 17, 1932. The cause of death was kidney failure, which was the result of working with the chemicals used in laundry in those days, specifically carbon tetrachloride. He is buried at Irving Park Cemetery, which, perhaps interestingly, is the same place where a number of the victims of the famous St. Valentine's Day Massacre are also buried. So ends an account of the lives of Thomas and Maria and their children. In the beginning I said that this presentation was created to give insight into the lives of those who have gone before us. This so that we know a little more about these people other than the simple tombstone facts. Even with this though, we can ask the question, do we really know who they were and what they were like? And of course we really don't. Not by a lot anyway. But by reading what is known of their story, it is possible to imagine them as the real people they were. I have done that consistently for so many hours as I searched through the multitude of records and historical facts that are available through Ancestry, records that have been hidden away in the many archives. Each of the many pieces of facts that I have been able to find now come together in the form of this video to tell their story. Some pieces are still waiting to be discovered, which will allow new facets of their lives to be revealed. This concludes the story of Thomas and Maria Moore and their children. But before we close, you could ask, what has happened to the farm at Drumharriff South in County Cavan, Ireland? The last of the Brownes who owned the farm was Margaret Irene Browne, known as Pearl. She had lived on the farm all her life and worked the land along with her older brother and sister, Charles Henry Browne, known as Henry, and Florence Browne, known as Flory. None of these three ever married or had children, and therefore there was no close family member to pass the farm on to. Both Henry and Flory predeceased Pearl. Pearl willed the property to a local farmer who had been very kind to her over the years, named Willie Ritchie. Pearl died in December 2017. Pearl's great-grandfather, John Browne, was instrumental as a main contributor in the building of the Presbyterian Church in Cootehill, built in 1876. It is the final resting place for all of the Brownes who died at Drumharriff since that time. However, no Browne graves have place markings, as it was felt that this was too showy, according to Pearl. Maria Jane Browne was Pearl's grand-aunt. And finally, here are a few pictures from visits by visiting relatives to the Browne family at Drumharriff over the years. Pearl and her siblings and their parents before them had received visits from their Canadian relatives from time to time over a number of years. Perhaps the earliest of these visits was during the war years when my father, Harry Connors, dropped by unannounced. He was a Canadian soldier in training in England before being deployed to France and was allowed leave to go to Ireland to find his relatives. He knew the name of the family and the town they were near, and that was Cootehill, of course. It wasn't hard finding the farm after asking Cootehill locals. Once there and invited in, Harry was able to verify the family connection due to the fact, and somewhat amazingly, that there was a portrait of a woman hanging on the kitchen wall. And it was a duplicate to a portrait that was hanging in his mother's house in Bowmanville, Ontario. It's not known for sure, but we can assume that it was Maria's portrait. Although Florence had never been there, she had learned a great deal about the physical layout of the house and the land from her mother, Maria. So Florence passed all of this information along to granddaughter Madge. In later years, when Madge was an adult and visited Drumharriff for the first time, she says she knew exactly where everything was, the cow barn, the horse barn, the rooms of the house, and that it immediately gave her a feeling of being home. Part of the land near the house is terraced down towards the house, and Madge knew in advance all of those details. The living relatives of the Brownes at Drumharriff will always have a connection to the farm, even though it is no longer in the family. Unfortunately, there was no such connection maintained to the Moore farm and family through the years. This is due to the fact that we were not aware of its location, and it wasn't until 2016, when I found the official marriage record for Thomas and Maria, that I was able to pinpoint the farm and the family Thomas was a part of. I have recently learned that the land where Thomas's family was from is no longer owned by a Moore. However, the current owner continues to call his property Moore's Land. The wonderful music throughout this video is the work of Dr. Walter Keeley and his friends. I met Dr. Keeley, who is a physician, a number of years ago when we were both working. I was traveling around the province at the time extolling on the virtues of electronic medical record systems for physicians. After our meeting, we spent a number of hours with Wendy, his then fiancée. We'd had a relaxing dinner and listened to great music throughout the time. At the end of the evening, and as I was leaving, Dr. Keeley gave me a copy of his CD with traditional Irish music, and I have played it as one of my favourites innumerable times over the years since. Our meeting was a lucky and most welcome coincidence. Dr. Keeley comes from Ireland. Through his work, he has connections to County Cavan, and as a result knows Cootill well. He had received his medical education in Dublin, and then in 1970 did a 6 months residency in surgery and another 6 months in medicine in Cavan. He left the area for a while but returned in 1972 and 73 for a further 6 months in medicine and 6 months in obstetrics as a senior house officer. In all, Dr. Keeley spent 2 years working in Cavan. I say that our meeting was a lucky and happy coincidence because what could be more appropriate than having Irish traditional music provided by a group led by an Irishman who spent the time he did in Cavan? It is with the kind permission of Dr. Walter Keeley that allows us to listen within this video to the music he and his friends produced, and I can't thank him enough. Please enjoy these excellent renditions of traditional Irish music put forth by Dr. Walter Keeley and friends.